The rain fell in sheets against the windshield, each drop catching the red glow of the traffic light ahead. Inside the taxi, the air was thick with something harder to name than humidity, something that made breathing feel like a deliberate act. Marcus kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, fingers at 10 and 2, even though the car was stopped, even though he'd done nothing wrong. The passenger in the back seat had been silent for 3 blocks now. Not the comfortable silence of someone lost in thought or tired from a long day. This was the kind of silence that pressed against your shoulders, that made you check the rearview mirror more often than you needed to. Marcus had checked it 17 times since leaving the airport. He'd counted. She sat rigid, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like a shield. Her eyes fixed on the phone in her hand. But she wasn't scrolling, wasn't reading. The screen had gone dark 2 minutes ago. She was just holding it, her knuckles pale against the leather strap of her bag. Through the mirror, Marcus could see the tension in her jaw, the way she'd shifted closer to the door after they merged onto the highway. He'd seen that shift before, too many times. The light turned green, and Marcus eased the taxi forward, the rhythm of the wipers filling the space between them. Swish, thump, swish, thump. Like a heartbeat that couldn't quite settle into calm. The GPS on his dashboard showed 23 more minutes to her destination in the northern suburbs. 23 minutes of this silence. 23 minutes of wondering what he'd done to deserve the way she'd flinched when he'd offered to help with her luggage. Outside, the city blurred past in streaks of neon and sodium light. A woman ran for cover under a storefront awning. A bus hissed to a stop, exhaling diesel and rain. Somewhere, a siren wailed in the distance, and Marcus felt the passenger tense, even more, if that was possible. He adjusted his grip on the wheel. "Storm's getting worse," he said softly, keeping his voice steady, neutral, friendly, but not too friendly. It was a calculation he'd learned to make without thinking, how much humanity to show before it became threatening simply because of who was showing it. The passenger didn't respond, just hugged her bag tighter. Marcus had been driving for 12 years. 12 years of picking up strangers and delivering them safely to wherever they needed to go. 12 years of small talk and silence, of generous tips and exact change, of genuine smiles and the other kind, the kind that never reached the eyes. He thought he'd developed thick skin, thought he'd learned not to take it personally when people like this woman treated him like something dangerous they'd been forced to sit near. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the rain, relentless and cold. Maybe it was the weight of all those other rides, all those other passengers who'd gripped their bags a little tighter, who'd asked him to turn on the interior light so they could see better, who'd made phone calls to announce exactly where they were and who they were with, voices loud enough to make sure he heard. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the bone-deep kind that comes from being seen as a threat before you're seen as a person. Or maybe it was the way her hand had moved to her phone the moment she got in, her finger hovering over the screen like she was ready to call someone. Anyone. The police. The GPS chirped, directing him to stay in the left lane. 21 minutes now. Marcus indicated and moved over, the smooth motion of someone who'd driven these roads 1,000 times. In the back, he heard a sharp intake of breath. When he glanced in the mirror, the passenger was staring at the back of his head, her eyes wide, her whole body pressed against the door. Like she was preparing to jump.
What happens when fear meets innocence on a rain-soaked highway? When the distance between two people in the same car becomes an ocean neither knows how to cross? When every mile forward feels like it's taking you somewhere you can't come back from, Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel and kept driving. But he had no idea that in exactly 18 minutes, everything would change. Marcus Antoine had never planned to be a taxi driver. As a boy growing up in the south side of the city, he dreamed of becoming an engineer, the kind who designed bridges that connected places, that made it easier for people to reach each other. He used to sketch them in the margins of his notebooks during math class, great soaring structures with cables like harp strings, strong enough to hold the weight of thousands crossing over each day. Life had other plans. His father's illness came first, then the medical bills, then the necessary choice between college and keeping the family afloat. Marcus was 19 when he got his taxi license. Just temporary, he'd told himself, just until things stabilized. That was 12 years ago. Now, at 31, Marcus had built a different kind of life. Not the one he'd drawn in those notebook margins, but one with its own quiet dignity. He knew every street in the city, every shortcut and back road, which routes flooded in heavy rain, and which neighborhoods tipped well during the holidays. He knew where to find the best coffee at 3 in the morning, and which dispatchers would throw him the good airport runs. He kept his taxi immaculate. No air freshener covering up neglect, but genuinely clean. With leather seats he conditioned every month, and floor mats he replaced twice a year. His daughter Zoe, 7 years old, with her mother's bright eyes and his careful way of thinking, had once asked him why he spent so much time cleaning his car. They'd been in the driveway on a Saturday morning, Zoe helping him vacuum the back seat, her small hands serious around the hose attachment. "Because this is how I take care of people," Marcus had told her, emptying coins from the cup holders. "When someone gets in my car, they're trusting me with more than just getting them where they need to go. They're trusting me with their time, their safety, their peace of mind. The least I can do is make sure everything's clean and comfortable." Zoe had nodded solemnly, then asked if that meant she had to clean her room the same way. Marcus had laughed, scooping her up despite her squirming protests. Nice try, Bug, but yes. His ex-wife Nina lived across town with her new husband, an accountant who worked reasonable hours and came home before dark. The divorce had been amicable as ending can be, born not from cruelty but from the slow realization that they'd become ships passing in different directions. Nina had wanted stability, predictability, someone who could make it to parent-teacher conferences and family dinners. Marcus wanted that too, desperately, but his work made promises he couldn't always keep. Still, they co-parented well. Marcus had Zoe every Wednesday evening and alternate weekends, time he protected with the fierceness of someone who knew how quickly it could slip away. They had rituals. Wednesday was pizza and homework night. Saturdays were for the library and whatever adventure Zoe wanted. Sundays were for teaching her to cook the recipes Marcus's grandmother had taught him, gumbo and jambalaya and red beans that simmered for hours, filling his small apartment with the smell of home. "Daddy," Zoe had said last Sunday, stirring the pot carefully while standing on a step stool, "why does good food take so long?"
Marcus had looked down at her, at the concentration on her face, and felt that familiar ache of love mixed with longing, for more time, for a different life, for the ability to give her everything she deserved. Because the best things can't be rushed, Bug. They need time to become what they're meant to be. She'd considered this, then nodded. Like how I'm growing up? Exactly like that. That conversation had been 3 days ago. Now, driving through the rain with this silent, frightened passenger in his back seat, Marcus found himself thinking about it again. About time and what it makes of us. About patience and fear and the distance between good intentions and how they're received. He'd picked up the woman at the airport at 8:47 p.m. Her flight had been delayed, and she'd been one of the last passengers to emerge from baggage claim, pulling a navy suitcase with a squeaky wheel, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started to fray. Marcus had been holding his phone with her name on the screen, Jennifer Whitmore, pickup for the northern suburbs. "Ms. Whitmore?" he'd asked, keeping a respectful distance, his voice warm but professional. She looked up, and Marcus had seen it immediately, that flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or hesitation. She'd glanced back toward the terminal, then at her phone, then at him again. For a moment, he thought she might cancel the ride, request someone else. It happened sometimes. Usually, people were less obvious about it. "Yes," she'd finally said, her voice tight, "that's me." Marcus had reached for her suitcase. "Let me get that for you." "I've got it." Quick, firm, leaving no room for argument. He'd led her to the taxi, unlocked the doors remotely so she could see inside. Another trick he'd learned, making everything visible, removing any reason for alarm. The interior light had come on, showing the clean seats, the phone charger he kept plugged in, the small box of tissues on the center console. Normal, safe, nothing to fear. But when Jennifer Whitmore had climbed into the back seat instead of the front, which was her right, passengers could sit wherever they wanted, she'd immediately locked her door. Not subtly. The click had been loud in the humid night air. Marcus had loaded her suitcase into the trunk, closed it gently, and gotten behind the wheel. He'd adjusted the mirror, entered the destination, and pulled away from the curb with the smooth confidence of someone who'd made this same journey hundreds of times. And from that moment, he'd felt the weight of her fear like a physical thing pressing down on the car. He'd tried once to break the ice. Long day of travel? A pause, then, yes. Nothing more. Just that single word, delivered like a door closing. So Marcus had stopped trying, had settled into the silence, into the familiar rhythm of driving, of reading traffic patterns and anticipating lane changes, of being professional, even when professionalism felt like performing invisibility. He was good at this, at making himself small, unthreatening, at projecting calm competence without appearing too confident. It was an art form he'd never wanted to learn, but had mastered out of necessity. The rain had started just as they merged onto the highway. Just a drizzle at first, then quickly building into the kind of storm that turned the world into watercolor, blurring boundaries and washing everything in shades of gray. Marcus had turned on the wipers, slowed slightly to account for the slick roads, and felt Jennifer Whitmore's tension spike with the change in speed. This was the reality of his work he'd long ago accepted. Not everyone saw him as Marcus, father, son, man who still dreams sometimes of bridges reaching across distances. Some people saw only what fear taught them to see, saw skin color before they saw character, saw danger in the dark rather than someone trying to make an honest living.
But acceptance didn't mean it didn't hurt. Didn't mean that on nights like this, with the rain coming down and silence pressing in from all sides, Marcus didn't wonder what would have happened if he'd finished college, if he'd become that engineer, if people met him in conference rooms instead of back seats, if they'd be afraid of him there, too. The GPS showed 18 minutes to destination. Marcus checked his mirrors, habit and caution in equal measure, and noticed a police cruiser several cars back. Just driving, nothing unusual. But in the back seat, Jennifer Whitmore had noticed too, and her hand was moving toward her phone again, slow and deliberate. Marcus's heart rate picked up despite himself. He'd done nothing wrong, was doing nothing wrong, was simply driving, professionally and safely, exactly as he'd done thousands of times before. But he knew that innocence wasn't always enough, knew that the gap between what was true and what someone believed could become a chasm in seconds. "Everything okay back there?" he asked quietly, his eyes on the road. No answer, just the sound of her breathing, quick and shallow, and the relentless percussion of rain against glass. 16 minutes to destination. Marcus drove on, his hand steady on the wheel, even as everything inside him began to brace for whatever was coming. Because something was coming. He could feel it the way you feel a storm before the first drops fall. That electric charge in the air, that sense of the world holding its breath. He just didn't know yet what form it would take, or how badly it would try to break him.
The highway stretched ahead like a dark river, its surface reflecting red taillights in fractured patterns. Marcus stayed in the center lane, maintaining a steady 60 miles per hour, fast enough to keep traffic flowing, slow enough to account for the rain that was now coming down in heavy curtains. The truck in front of them threw up spray that the wipers struggled to clear, and Marcus added a few more feet of following distance, his movements calm and measured. In the back seat, Jennifer Whitmore had her phone in her hand now, the screen glowing blue against her face. Marcus couldn't see what she was doing, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her thumb moved over the screen without quite touching it, like she was deciding something, working up to something. The police cruiser was still behind them, 3 cars back. Marcus told himself it meant nothing, told himself they were just driving the same route, heading in the same direction, that there were hundreds of cars on this highway, and this was just coincidence. But his hands were starting to sweat against the steering wheel, and he had to consciously stop himself from checking the rearview mirror every 10 seconds. Fear has a smell, he'd learned over the years, metallic and sharp, like copper and adrenaline. It was in the car now, thick enough that Marcus couldn't tell if it was coming from Jennifer or himself, or both of them, feeding off each other in some terrible feedback loop of anxiety and suspicion. "We'll be there in about 15 minutes, Marcus said, keeping his voice even. Professional. Traffic's moving well, despite the rain. Jennifer didn't respond, but her thumb finally touched the screen. Marcus heard the faint click of her typing something. His stomach tightened. He knew what she was doing, had seen it before, though usually it was more subtle, a text to a friend, a photo of the license plate, a casual just checking in call that was really about creating a record, a witness, evidence. He didn't blame people for being careful. The world could be dangerous. But it still stung, being treated like the danger itself, when all you were trying to do was help someone get home safely. The truck ahead changed lanes, and Marcus smoothly followed, maintaining that careful distance. Behind them, the police cruiser did the same. Jennifer's breathing got faster.
Marcus's mind raced through the checklist he always kept. Registration current, license valid, no tickets, no warrants, nothing that would give anyone a reason to pull him over. His taxi license was in the visor, along with his commercial insurance card and the city permit that allowed him to pick up airport fares. Everything was in order. Everything was legitimate. But he'd known men, good men, careful men, who'd had everything in order and still ended up face down on pavement because someone decided they looked threatening. Because someone was afraid. Because everything could go wrong in the space between explanation and misunderstanding. "Excuse me," Jennifer said suddenly, her voice cutting through the sound of rain. "Can you pull over?" Marcus's heart jumped. "Pull over? We're on the highway, ma'am." "At the next exit. I need you to pull over." He glanced in the mirror, trying to read her face. "Is something wrong? Are you feeling sick?" "Just pull over, please." There was an edge to her voice now, not quite panic, but close to it. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. The next exit was 2 miles ahead. 2 miles of wondering what this was about, what she thought he'd done, what she was planning to do when they stopped. "Okay," he said quietly. "The next exit is in about 2 miles. I'll pull into a gas station or something well lit." He put on his turn signal, started moving toward the right lane. The police cruiser was still behind them, still following. Maybe this was nothing. Maybe she really was feeling sick from the flight, from the turbulence that had delayed her arrival, from something she'd eaten. Maybe this had nothing to do with him at all. But Marcus had lived 31 years in this body, in this skin, in a world that had taught him to never assume the best-case scenario, had taught him that sometimes being right didn't matter as much as being perceived wrong. The exit appeared through the rain, a curving ramp that led down to a commercial strip with a gas station, a fast food restaurant, and a closed auto parts store. Marcus took the turn smoothly, water hissing under the tires, and pulled into the gas station's parking lot. He chose a spot under the bright fluorescent lights, directly in view of the security cameras he could see mounted on the building's overhang. Another lesson learned: always be visible, always be recorded.
Your safety might depend on what the cameras saw. He put the car in park but left the engine running, the wipers still beating their steady rhythm. In the mirror, he watched Jennifer Whitmore gather her bag, her movements quick and jerky. She was scared, genuinely scared. And that scared him because he didn't know what she was about to do with that fear. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm going to step out of the vehicle and give you some space, okay? I'll be right outside if you need anything." He didn't wait for her to respond, just opened his door slowly, stepped out into the rain, and moved a few feet away from the taxi. The rain soaked through his polo shirt immediately, cold and shocking, but he barely noticed. He kept his hands visible, kept his posture open and unthreatening, kept his eyes on the taxi, where Jennifer was now fumbling with her seatbelt. The police cruiser had taken the same exit, was now pulling into the gas station parking lot. Marcus's pulse hammered in his ears, louder than the rain. This was it. Whatever this was, it was happening now. He ran through the script he'd rehearsed in his head 100 times, the one he hoped he'd never need. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, don't make sudden movements. Say yes, sir, and no, sir, and explain clearly, simply, without emotion that might be mistaken for aggression. Comply with everything. Survive first. Sort it out later.
The cruiser pulled up alongside the taxi, and 2 officers got out, a man and a woman, both in rain jackets with reflective strips that caught the light. They approached cautiously, hands near their belts, eyes scanning the scene. "Everything okay here?" the male officer called out, his voice professional but wary. Before Marcus could answer, Jennifer burst out of the back seat, stumbling slightly as she hit the wet pavement. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice shaking. I was—" She stopped, looked at Marcus, looked back at the officers. "I'm not sure, but something felt wrong." The female officer moved closer to Jennifer, her body language shifting into protection mode. "Did something happen, ma'am? Did he hurt you?" "No, Jennifer hugged herself, rain plastering her hair to her face. "He was taking back roads. It didn't feel right. I didn't feel safe." Marcus felt the words hit him like physical blows. Back roads. Didn't feel safe. The implications hung in the air, heavier than the rain. He started to speak, to explain that they'd been on the highway the entire time, that he'd followed the GPS exactly, that he'd done nothing, except try to get her home safely. But the male officer was already approaching him, one hand raised. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them." "They are," Marcus said, his voice steady, even though everything inside him was screaming. "They're right here. I haven't done anything wrong." "Where were you taking the passenger?" Marcus gave the address, the same one programmed into his GPS. "Straight from the airport. We've been on I-90 the whole time. You can check the GPS logs. You can check the route." The officer glanced at the GPS screen, still glowing through the windshield. Then at Jennifer, who was talking rapidly to the female officer, her words tumbling out between sobs that Marcus couldn't quite believe were genuine. There was something performed about them, something that made him realize she wasn't crying out of fear. She was crying because she'd realized what she'd done, what she'd set in motion, and maybe there was no way to take it back now. The female officer was pulling out her notepad. This was becoming official, a report, a record. His name, his license, his livelihood, all of it about to be written down and filed away as part of a complaint, an accusation, a narrative where he was the threat instead of the professional just trying to do his job. "Officer," Marcus said, and he hated how his voice cracked slightly, how 12 years of keeping calm under pressure suddenly felt like it might shatter. "I've been driving taxi for 12 years, without a single complaint. I have a daughter. I have regulars who request me by name. I didn't take any back roads. I stayed on the highway the entire time, because that's the route. That's always the route. You can verify everything I'm saying." The male officer studied him, rain running down the brim of his cap. Marcus couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell if he saw a man or a threat, a father or a predator, someone telling the truth or someone who'd gotten caught.
He was driving fine, the officer finally said, not to his partner. We were behind them for the last 10 minutes. No erratic behavior, no unusual turns, standard highway driving. The female officer looked up from her notepad, looked at Jennifer, who'd gone very still. Ma'am, you said he took back roads? Jennifer's face crumpled. It felt like... She looked at the taxi, at the GPS screen visible through the windshield, at the straight line showing their route from airport to exit, at the truth, simple and undeniable, displayed in blue and white pixels. I was scared, she whispered. Of what? The male officer asked, not unkindly, but directly. Did he threaten you? Say anything inappropriate?
No, but Jennifer's voice dropped even lower. He's so quiet. He barely talked, and I didn't know where we were going. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood in the rain, his hands still visible, still open, still showing he had nothing to hide, and felt something break inside him. Not anger. Anger was dangerous. Anger would confirm everything people already believed. Just a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. He was so tired of this, so tired of being quiet, being suspicious, of being friendly, being threatening, of his existence requiring such careful calibration just to be seen as human. The female officer was still looking at Jennifer, her expression harder now. So he didn't threaten you, didn't touch you, didn't take an unusual route. You were scared because... Jennifer didn't answer, couldn't answer, because how do you explain fear that has no logical basis? How do you put into words the prejudices you didn't even know you carried until they exploded in a parking lot under fluorescent lights with 2 police officers and 1 soaking wet man whose only crime was being born in the wrong skin? I'm sorry, Jennifer finally whispered. I'm so sorry. I panicked. Marcus waited for someone to say something, to acknowledge what had just happened, what had almost happened, how close this had come to going very differently. But the officers were quiet, exchanging looks that held entire conversations Marcus wasn't part of. They were weighing things, complaints and paperwork and liability and truth, trying to figure out how to handle this situation that had suddenly revealed itself to be not what it seemed. Sir, the male officer finally said to Marcus, do you want to press charges for false accusation? The question hung in the rain. Marcus looked at Jennifer, saw her face pale even further, saw the way her hands were shaking. Saw a woman who'd let fear override sense, who'd nearly destroyed his life because she couldn't see past her own panic, who was sorry now, but only because the truth had been impossible to deny. But he was so tired, and he had a daughter who needed her father to come home, not to spend the next weeks or months tied up in legal proceedings. Had a life he needed to keep living, customers he needed to keep serving. Had already lost hours of work and emotional energy to this nightmare. No, Marcus said quietly. I just want to finish the ride and go home. The officer nodded slowly. Ma'am, he said to Jennifer, you can arrange another ride. We'll wait with you until it arrives. Jennifer looked at Marcus, her eyes red and swollen. I'm so sorry, she said again, and this time there was something genuine in it. I didn't mean... It's fine, Marcus said, even though it wasn't, even though none of this was fine. He just wanted it to be over. He got back in the taxi, his clothes dripping water onto the seats he'd conditioned so carefully, started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot without looking at Jennifer Whitmore standing there with the 2 officers, probably calling for an Uber or a Lyft, another taxi with another driver who'd have no idea what had just happened. The highway was quieter now, the rain starting to ease into a lighter drizzle. Marcus drove mechanically, his mind numb, his body running on autopilot. He didn't turn on music, Didn't think about his next fare, or what he'd tell Nina, or how he'd explain to Zoe why Daddy seemed sad during their pizza and homework night tomorrow. He just drove. And somewhere around mile marker 53, he started to cry, quiet tears that mixed with the rain still drying on his face, that came from a place deeper than anger or even hurt. They came from grief, for the person he'd had to become to survive this world, for the careful calibration he performed every day just to be seen as safe, for his daughter, who'd one day face her own versions of this same exhausting dance. Maybe this was never about race, he thought. Maybe it was just about fear, about people who'd been taught to be afraid and never questioned who'd taught them or why. But no, that was too easy, too comfortable. Race had everything to do with it, with why Jennifer saw him as a threat, with why the police had approached with hands on belts, with why he'd had to rehearse his own defense in his head just in case his innocence wasn't obvious enough. Marcus pulled over again, this time at a rest stop, and sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the heat on high, trying to warm himself from the inside out. He called the dispatch. Marcus, the night dispatcher said, concern immediate in her voice. She'd been doing this job longer than he'd been driving, had heard every story. "You okay? I got a notification about your location." "I'm fine, Rita. Just—" He stopped, not knowing how to explain what had just happened. "I need to take the rest of the night off." "You got it, honey. Go home. Take care of yourself." Marcus sat there for another 10 minutes, watching other cars come and go. Normal people, having normal nights, going home to normal problems. And he envied them so much it ached. But eventually, he put the car in drive and headed back toward the city, toward his small apartment that would be cold and dark, toward the life he'd built that felt suddenly fragile, like it could all come apart with one phone call, one accusation, one moment of someone else's fear. When he got home, he didn't call Nina, didn't check his phone for messages, just sat on his couch in his wet clothes and stared at nothing until exhaustion finally pulled him under into uneasy sleep. He dreamed of bridges, the ones he used to draw as a boy, but in the dream they kept collapsing under the weight of people trying to cross, falling into dark water, and he couldn't fix them fast enough, couldn't make them strong enough, couldn't build something that wouldn't break. When he woke up Wednesday morning, there was a text from Zoe. "Pizza tonight, Daddy. I got 100 on my spelling test." Marcus stared at the message, at the joy and trust radiating from those simple words, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't over. He couldn't let it be. Not just for him, but for her. For the world she was going to inherit. He got up, showered, put on clean clothes, made coffee, sat down at his small kitchen table and opened his laptop, started typing an email to the local ACLU chapter detailing what had happened, started looking up the taxi company's HR policies, the city's Civil Rights Commission, every avenue he could think of to make sure this was documented, understood, addressed. Because maybe pressing charges against Jennifer Whitmore wasn't the answer, but silence wasn't either. And then, while he was in the middle of typing, his phone rang, unknown number. Marcus almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Hello?" "Mr. Antoine?" A woman's voice, professional but warm. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm an attorney with the driver advocacy group. I received information about an incident last night involving you and a passenger." Marcus's heart rate picked up. "How did you—" "The officers who responded filed a report. One of them is married to a colleague of mine. She thought you should know that your rights may have been violated, and that there are options available to you." "Options?" "Mr. Antoine, what happened to you last night was discrimination, clear and documented. The passenger made accusations without basis, put you in danger with law enforcement, and caused you significant distress. You have grounds for a civil rights complaint, and possibly more." Marcus sat back in his chair, his coffee growing cold. I don't want to ruin her life. This isn't about ruining anyone's life. It's about accountability. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again to you or to any other driver. And it's about sending a message that fear doesn't justify harm. He thought about Zoe, about pizza and homework night, about the world he wanted her to grow up in. "Tell me more," Marcus said. Sarah Chen talked for 20 minutes, outlining the process, the precedents, the probable outcomes. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be quick, but it would be right. When they hung up, Marcus sat at his table for a long time, thinking. Then he called Nina. "Hey," she said, picking up on the second ring. "Everything okay? You sound weird." Marcus told her everything, about Jennifer Whitmore, about the parking lot, about the rain and the fear and the moment when he'd thought everything might fall apart, about the attorney who'd called this morning, about the choice he was facing. Nina was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What does your gut say?" "My gut says I'm tired, that I want to just move on." "And what does your heart say?" Marcus looked at the photo on his fridge. Zoe at her last birthday party, her face lit up with joy, her arms around his neck. "My heart says Zoe deserves better, that I can't teach her to stand up for herself if I won't do it myself." Then you know what to do. Marcus filed the complaint that afternoon. And 3 days later, when he had Zoe for their Saturday adventure, he told her about it in age-appropriate terms. About someone who'd been scared when they didn't need to be. About choosing to speak up instead of staying quiet. About building bridges even when it's hard. "Are you scared, Daddy?" Zoe asked, holding his hand as they walked through the park. "Yeah, Bug, a little." "But you're doing it anyway?" "That's what brave means, doing the right thing even when you're scared." Zoe squeezed his hand. "Then you're the bravest person I know." Marcus squeezed back, feeling tears prick his eyes. Maybe he was building bridges after all. Just not the kind he'd drawn in his notebooks. The kind that connected who we are to who we want to become. The kind that held the weight of truth even when fear tried to tear them down. The kind that lasted. The weeks that followed were harder than Marcus had imagined. The story went local, then regional, then briefly national, when a journalist picked it up and wrote a piece titled, "When Fear Becomes Discrimination, One Driver's Fight for Dignity." Marcus found himself doing interviews he never wanted to give, explaining over and over what it felt like to be seen as dangerous for simply existing, for doing his job, for being black in a taxi on a rainy night. Jennifer Whitmore released a statement through her own attorney. It was carefully worded, expressing regret for any misunderstanding and explaining that she'd acted out of an abundance of caution, but acknowledged that her actions had caused harm. It wasn't quite an apology, it wasn't quite accountability, but it was something. The taxi company stood by Marcus, which surprised him. They released their own statement supporting his complaint and announcing new mandatory bias training for all passengers, a requirement to acknowledge and agree to anti-discrimination policies before completing a booking. It was small. It might not change much, but it was progress. The driver advocacy group took the case seriously. Sarah Chen was relentless, building a narrative not just around one incident, but around a pattern, collecting testimony from other drivers who'd experienced similar situations, documenting the psychological toll, the economic impact, the systemic nature of the problem. And Jennifer Whitmore, it turned out, had a history. Not of overt racism, nothing so clear-cut, but of patterns. Complaints at her job about black colleagues feeling intimidated by her.
A previous Uber driver who'd left her a low rating with a note about unfounded accusations. Small things that alone might mean nothing, but together painted a picture of someone who'd never examined her own biases, who'd let fear guide her actions without questioning where that fear came from. Sarah Chen presented all of this during their preparation meetings, laying out documents across her desk like pieces of a puzzle that only made sense when you stepped back far enough to see the whole picture. Marcus had sat across from her, reading through complaint after complaint, incident after incident, and felt something twist in his stomach. "She's done this before," he'd said quietly. "Not exactly this, but yes, she has a pattern of perceiving threat where none exists, specifically from people of color. And that pattern has consequences." Sarah had looked at him over her reading glasses. "The question is, what do you want those consequences to be?" Marcus had gone home that night and couldn't eat dinner, couldn't focus on the basketball game playing on his television, couldn't stop thinking about all the other drivers, the ones who didn't have police officers who'd witnessed the truth, who didn't have GPS logs to prove their innocence, who'd been fired or arrested or worse because someone's fear had been believed more than their reality. He'd called his mother, something he only did when the weight got too heavy to carry alone. "Baby," she'd said, in that voice that had soothed scraped knees and broken hearts and every hurt in between, "what's troubling you?" Marcus had told her everything, about Jennifer Whitmore's history, about the choice he was facing, to push for real consequences or to let it go, about feeling exhausted by the responsibility of fighting when all he'd wanted was to drive people safely from one place to another. His mother had been quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your daddy used to say that the hardest part about being a black man in this country wasn't the big moments of injustice. It was deciding every single day whether you had the energy to fight or whether you just needed to survive. And Marcus, baby, both of those choices are valid. Both of them are enough." "But what would Daddy do?" "Your daddy would ask what kind of world you want Zoe to inherit, and then he'd do whatever brought that world a little bit closer, even if it cost him." Marcus had known then what he had to do. The mediation hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November, 5 weeks after that rainy night on the highway. Marcus wore a suit, the same one he'd worn to his father's funeral, pressed and clean, an armor of respectability he wished he didn't need. Sarah Chen met him outside the municipal building, her briefcase heavy with documentation, her expression confident but kind. "Remember," she said as they walked up the steps, "this isn't about revenge. It's about recognition, about getting acknowledgement that what happened to you was wrong, and that there are consequences for treating people as threats simply because of how they look." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. He'd barely slept the night before, kept awake by anxiety and doubt and the persistent question, was this worth it? Was putting himself through this scrutiny, this exposure, this rehashing of the worst night worth whatever outcome they might achieve?
Then he'd gotten a text from Nina at 2 in the morning. "Zoe keeps telling her friends her daddy is a hero. She's right. Don't forget that tomorrow." So here he was, climbing courthouse steps, carrying his dignity in trembling hands. The mediation room was smaller than Marcus had expected, windowless with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill, and a long table that seemed designed to keep people at a distance. Jennifer Whitmore was already there when they arrived, sitting beside her attorney, a man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive watch that caught the light when he moved. She looked smaller than Marcus remembered, diminished somehow, her shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make herself disappear. When Marcus walked in, she looked up, and their eyes met for just a second before she looked away. But in that second, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected, genuine remorse. Not the calculated kind that comes from knowing you're in trouble, but the raw kind that comes from truly understanding the harm you've caused. Or maybe he just wanted to see it. Maybe he needed to believe she was capable of change, because the alternative, that she'd go back to her life unchanged, that this had all been for nothing, was too bleak to contemplate. The mediator was a woman named Judge Patricia Okafor, retired from family court, known for her fairness and her unwillingness to tolerate nonsense from anyone. She was in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth beneath whatever people presented. Marcus had read about her, knew she'd built her career on protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. If anyone could navigate this impossible situation, it was her. "Let's be clear about why we're here," Judge Okafor began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades witnessing human nature at its worst and occasionally at its best. "Mr. Antoine, you filed a complaint alleging discrimination, emotional distress, and damages to your professional reputation. Ms. Whitmore, you've acknowledged that your actions caused harm, but maintained that you acted out of legitimate concern for your safety. Is that accurate?" Both attorneys confirmed. Judge Okafor nodded, making notes on the legal pad in front of her. "Then let's talk about fear," she continued, "about what makes it legitimate and what makes it discrimination, about where the line is between protecting yourself and projecting harm onto others who've done nothing to deserve it." The next 3 hours were some of the hardest of Marcus's life. Sarah Chen presented their case methodically, building a narrative that was impossible to refute. She showed the GPS logs that proved the route never deviated, not once, not by a single turn, from the standard path between airport and northern suburbs. She presented the police report, with the officer's observations that Marcus had been driving properly, that there was no erratic behavior, no cause for alarm. She called character witnesses via video conference, regular passengers who requested Marcus specifically, who praised his professionalism and kindness, who spoke about how safe they felt in his care. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an elderly white woman who'd been using Marcus's services for 6 years, was particularly compelling. "That young man has driven me to every doctor's appointment, every family gathering, every place I've needed to go since my husband passed," she said, her voice firm despite her age. "He's helped me with my walker. He's waited with me when appointments ran late. He's treated me with more respect and care than my own grandchildren sometimes show. The idea that anyone would be afraid of Marcus, that tells me everything I need to know about them and nothing about him." Marcus had to look away, blinking back tears. Then Sarah presented Jennifer's history. The complaints from colleagues, 3 black co-workers at her marketing firm who'd reported feeling targeted by her behavior, watched with suspicion, questioned about their presence in ways white colleagues never were. The previous rideshare incident, where another driver had noted Jennifer's unfounded fear and accusations. A neighborhood dispute where Jennifer had called police on a black teenager selling candy for his school fundraiser, claiming he was acting suspicious. With each revelation, Jennifer seemed to shrink further into her chair. Her attorney tried to object, to claim that past incidents were irrelevant, but Judge Okafor shut him down firmly. Pattern of behavior is absolutely relevant when determining whether an action was isolated or systemic. Continue, Miss Chen. The evidence was damning. It painted a picture not of one bad night, but of a lifetime of unchecked bias, of fear that had been taught and never questioned, of assumptions that had hardened into certainty without ever being challenged by actual experience or evidence. When it was Jennifer's attorney's turn, he tried to mount a defense based on statistics, crime rates, incidents of violence against women, media coverage that portrayed urban areas as dangerous. He talked about the reasonable person standard, about how any woman alone at night with a stranger had cause for concern. Judge Okafor let him finish, then leaned forward, her expression stern. "Counselor, are you seriously arguing that being alone with someone of a different race constitutes reasonable cause for fear?"
The attorney backtracked quickly. Not race specifically, Your Honor, but what? The circumstances were entirely ordinary. Daytime airport pickup, licensed taxi driver, standard route, professional behavior. The only variable that triggered your client's fear response was Mr. Antoine's race. You can dress it up in language about safety and caution all you want, but at its core, this is discrimination, pure and simple. The room fell silent. Even Jennifer's expensive attorney seemed at a loss for words. Then Jennifer spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's right." Her attorney turned to her sharply. "Ms. Whitmore, I advise you not to." "No." Jennifer's voice got stronger. "She's right. You're right. All of it is right." She looked at Judge Okafor, then at Sarah Chen, then finally at Marcus. "I was wrong. Not just that night, but for a long time before that. I've been carrying fear and calling it caution. I've been acting on prejudice and calling it instinct. And I hurt you because of it. I could have destroyed your life because I never questioned where my fear came from or whether it was justified." Tears were streaming down her face now. Not the performed kind from that night in the parking lot, but the messy, ashamed kind that came from being forced to confront the worst parts of yourself in front of witnesses. I don't know how to explain it, except that I've been taught my whole life to be afraid, to be careful, to trust my gut. And somewhere along the way, my gut learned to be afraid of people who look like you. And I never questioned it. I just accepted it, like it was natural, like it was keeping me safe. She took a shuddering breath. But it wasn't keeping me safe. It was just keeping me ignorant, and I'm so sorry. Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. This was what he'd needed to hear, not excuses or justifications, but acknowledgement. Not deflection, but ownership. The recognition that the harm was real and rooted in something deeper than one bad night.
"My daughter," Jennifer continued, her voice breaking, "she's 10 years old. And when I told her what happened, not the version I wanted to tell, but the truth, she asked me if I was a racist. She asked me if she should be afraid of black people too, since her mother was." Jennifer's face crumpled. "And I didn't know how to answer her, because I don't think I'm a racist. I don't hate anyone. I don't use slurs. I vote for equality measures. But what I did to you was racist. My actions were racist, even if I don't want to believe I am. And I don't know how to hold both of those things at once." Judge Okafor's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Ms. Whitmore, racism isn't just about hatred or conscious malice. It's about the systems we participate in, the assumptions we carry, the harm we cause even when we don't intend it. You can be a person who believes in equality and still do racist things. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you defend it, or do you change?" "I want to change," Jennifer whispered. "I need to change." The room was silent for a long moment, heavy with the weight of confession and consequence. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A recognition that growth was possible, that people could look at their own ugliness and choose transformation. But was that enough? Did good intentions matter if they only came after being caught? Did the promise of change erase the harm already done? "Ms. Whitmore," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence, surprising himself by speaking. Everyone turned to look at him. "I don't know if you're a racist. I don't think you do either. Maybe that's something you'll spend the rest of your life figuring out. But I know that what you did that night could have gotten me killed." Jennifer flinched as if struck. "I know that I went home and couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about what would have happened if those officers had been different, if they'd believed your fear more than my innocence, If they'd seen me as a threat first and asked questions later. If there hadn't been cameras. If they hadn't followed us long enough to see I was driving normally. If any of a dozen things had gone slightly differently, I could be dead, or in jail, or fired and blacklisted, unable to support my daughter. Marcus's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. He pressed them flat on the table. I had to explain to my 7-year-old daughter why some people are scared of Daddy just because of how he looks. I had to watch her little face process that information, watch her try to understand why the world works that way. And that conversation broke something in me I'm still trying to put back together. So no, I'm not interested in your apology if it's just words. I'm not interested in your regret if it's just about feeling better about yourself. Then what do you want from me? Jennifer asked, her voice raw. Tell me what I can do to make this right. Marcus looked at Sarah Chen, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. They'd discussed this, prepared for this moment. But sitting here, actually facing Jennifer Whitmore, Marcus found his carefully rehearsed words shifting into something more honest. I want you to do the work, he said. Real work. Not just taking a diversity training class and checking a box. I want you to actually examine where these beliefs came from. I want you to get uncomfortable. I want you to put yourself in spaces where you're not centered, where you have to listen more than you speak, where you have to confront the ways you've been complicit in systems that harm people like me. Jennifer was nodding, tears still streaming. Yes, anything. I want you to complete an intensive bias training program. Not the corporate kind you sit through once and forget, but something real, something that actually changes how you see the world. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. And I want you to volunteer, 50 hours minimum, working with communities of color. Actually get to know the people you've been taught to fear. Learn their names, their stories, their humanity. I'll do it, Jennifer said immediately. I'll do whatever it takes. And I want a public apology, Marcus continued, his voice stronger now. Not a statement through lawyers that gets buried in legal language, a real one, in your own words, where you tell the truth about what happened and why it was wrong, so that other people who might be carrying the same biases can hear it and maybe think twice before they act on their fear. Jennifer's attorney started to object. Ms. Whitmore, a public statement could expose you to... But Jennifer cut him off. I don't care about exposure. I care about being honest, about maybe preventing this from happening to someone else. She looked directly at Marcus. Yes, I'll do it, all of it, and I'll do it because it's right, not because I have to. Judge Okafor made notes, her pen scratching across the legal pad in sharp, decisive strokes. When she looked up, there was something in her expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. Approval, perhaps, or respect. Mr. Anton, she said carefully, these are substantial requests. They require Ms. Whitmore to commit significant time, emotional labor, and public vulnerability. Are you certain this is preferable to financial compensation? A settlement could be substantial, given the strength of your case. Marcus thought about his bank account, about the bills that were always due, about Zoe's future and the college fund he'd been trying to build for years. Money would make life easier. Money was practical, tangible, immediate. But money wouldn't change anything, wouldn't prevent the next Jennifer Whitmore from making the same assumptions, wouldn't teach anyone anything, wouldn't build the bridges Marcus still believed in, even after everything. I'm certain, he said firmly, money won't give me back what I lost that night, but maybe education can prevent someone else from losing it in the first place. The settlement was drafted over the next week, with lawyers going back and forth on specific language and requirements. Jennifer Whitmore would complete a 12-week intensive bias training program through the city's Office of Equity and Social Justice, not just attending, but actively participating, completing assignments, demonstrating growth. She would volunteer 50 hours with the East Side Community Development Center, working specifically with their youth programs in predominantly black neighborhoods.
And she would create a video statement to be shared on social media and the driver advocacy group's platforms, telling her story honestly and owning her mistakes publicly. The video statement requirement made Jennifer's attorney particularly nervous. "You understand this will follow you forever," he warned her. "Potential employers will find it. Friends will see it. You'll be opening yourself up to criticism, possibly harassment." "Good," Jennifer had said, surprising everyone. "Maybe I should be uncomfortable. Maybe that's part of the work." When the settlement was finalized and signed, Marcus walked out of the municipal building into crisp November air that smelled like fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Sarah Chen walked beside him, carrying her heavy briefcase, satisfaction evident in her stride. "You did something important today," she said, "not just for yourself, but for every driver who'll benefit from the precedent we set. This case is going to change policy. It already is."
Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of it. The responsibility that came with being the one who spoke up, who pushed back, who demanded more than the easiest resolution. It was exhausting. It was necessary. Both things could be true at once. "Thank you," he said to Sarah, "for believing me, for fighting for me." "Thank you for being brave enough to fight," she replied. "Most people would have taken a settlement and moved on. You chose the harder path. That matters." They parted ways at the parking garage, and Marcus drove home through the city he knew so well, taking the long route just to clear his head. Past the community center where Jennifer would soon be volunteering. Past the high school where Zoe would go one day. Past the neighborhoods that shaped him, that taught him both resilience and rage, that made him who he was. When he got home, there was a text from Nina. How did it go? Marcus called her instead of texting back, needing to hear a friendly voice. "It went okay," he told her. "Settlement's done. She agreed to everything we asked for." "How do you feel?" Marcus considered the question, really thought about it. "Tired," he admitted. "But maybe hopeful? I don't know. Ask me again in a few months when I see if anything actually changes." "It will," Nina said with certainty, "because you made sure it would. Zoe's going to be so proud when she's old enough to understand what you did." "She's proud now. She doesn't need to understand all of it." "Fair enough." Nina paused. "You're a good man, Marcus. I hope you know that, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise." After they hung up, Marcus sat in his quiet apartment and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. The fear from that night on the highway, the anger at being treated as dangerous, the grief for every other person who'd faced similar situations, without witnesses, without proof, without justice. The exhaustion of constantly having to prove his humanity. The fragile hope that maybe, slowly, things could get better. He cried. Not the quiet tears from that night on the highway, but the deep, gasping kind that came from releasing pressure that had been building for weeks. And when he was done, he felt lighter. Not fixed, not whole, but lighter. The next few months unfolded in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. Jennifer's apology video went viral, not because it was performative or shallow, but because it was painfully, uncomfortably honest. She sat in what looked like her living room, her face free of makeup, her voice shaking but clear, and told the truth. About her own prejudice. About how she'd been raised with subtle messages about who to fear and who to trust. About how she'd never questioned those messages until they'd hurt an innocent man. About how she was committing to change, not because she had to, but because she needed to. "I thought I was being careful," she said to the camera. "I thought I was protecting myself, but I was really just perpetuating harm. And if you're watching this and nodding along, if you've ever clutched your purse tighter when someone walked by, or crossed the street to avoid a black man, or made assumptions about danger based on nothing but skin color, please, I'm begging you, stop. Question where those instincts come from. Ask yourself if they're keeping you safe or just keeping you separated from people who deserve to be seen as human." The comment section was a war zone. Some people praising her courage, others saying it wasn't enough, still others defending her original fear. But buried in the arguments were threads of people admitting their own biases, sharing their own stories, committing to do better. Progress, Marcus thought, reading through the comments late one night. Messy, complicated, uncomfortable progress. 3 months after the settlement, Marcus got a call from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Mr. Antoine, this is Jennifer Whitmore." Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. They hadn't spoken directly since the mediation. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm not supposed to contact you. My attorney said it was a bad idea. But I wanted you to know that I finished the training program last week, and I've been volunteering at the community center." She paused, and Marcus could hear traffic in the background, could picture her walking somewhere, working up the courage to make this call. "I met a boy there, Jamal. He's 8. He wants to be an astronaut." Marcus waited, not sure where this was going. "He reminds me of my daughter. Same curiosity, same energy, same way of asking a million questions about everything. And I realized, if someone treated him the way I treated you, just because of how he looks, I would be furious. I would think that person was cruel and ignorant and wrong." Her voice cracked. "And I was that person, Mr. Antoine. I was that person, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure I never am again." "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked, his throat tight. "Because I wanted you to know that what you did, making me do this work instead of just taking money, it changed me, really changed me, and I'm grateful. I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness. I know I hurt you in ways I can't fully understand, but I wanted you to know that you turned the worst thing I've ever done into something that made me better. That's a gift I don't deserve, but will spend my life trying to honor." Marcus sat with that for a long moment, thought about anger and hurt and the exhausting work of forgiveness, thought about bridges and whether they could be built not just across spaces, but across damages. "I hope you mean that," he said finally. "I hope you keep meaning it, even when it's hard, even when no one's watching." "I will, I promise." They hung up, and Marcus sat in his quiet apartment, feeling something he hadn't felt since that rainy night. Hope. Not the naive kind that believes everything will be fine, but the harder, more resilient kind that believes change is possible if people are willing to do the work. He picked up his phone and texted Zoe, even though she was probably asleep at Nina's. "Love you, Bug. Thank you for making me brave." The response came 3 minutes later, breaking his own bedtime rules. "Love you too, Daddy. You're still my hero." Marcus smiled, wiped his eyes, and thought about tomorrow. About the rides he'd drive, the passengers he'd meet, the careful dance he'd still have to perform to stay safe in a world that didn't always see him clearly. But also about the small victories, about one person who'd been forced to examine her biases and had chosen to actually change, about the ripple effects that might create. Her daughter, the kids at the community center, the people who watched her apology video and saw themselves reflected back. About Zoe, growing up in a world that wasn't perfect, but was maybe slowly getting better because people were willing to fight for it. Marcus went to bed that night and didn't dream of collapsing bridges. Instead, he dreamed of the ones he'd drawn as a boy, strong and soaring, holding the weight of thousands crossing over, connecting places that had seemed impossibly distant, building something that lasted. Spring came to the city the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, with false starts and unexpected cold snaps before finally settling into warmth. Marcus noticed it first in the mornings, the way sunlight slanted through his apartment windows at a different angle, the way the birds started their chorus earlier each day, the way the air smelled like possibility instead of just exhaust and rain. He was still driving, still picking up strangers and taking them where they needed to go, still keeping his taxi immaculate, still calibrating his behavior to make passengers comfortable, still carrying the weight of being seen before being known. Some things hadn't changed. Some things might never change. But other things had.
The driver advocacy group had used Marcus's case as a springboard for broader reform. The city council passed new regulations requiring all rideshare and taxi companies to implement bias training for passengers, to create clear complaint procedures for drivers who experience discrimination, to track patterns of false accusations. It wasn't perfect, regulations never were, but it was something, a crack in the foundation of how things had always been done. Marcus had been invited to speak at the policy hearing, and he'd brought Zoe with him. Let her sit in the gallery and watch her father tell his story to a room full of officials who had the power to change things. Afterwards, Zoe had asked him if he was famous now. "No, Bug," Marcus had said, kneeling down to her level. "I'm just someone who refused to stay quiet when something wrong happened. That's not fame, that's responsibility." Can I be responsible too when I grow up? You can be responsible right now. Every time you see something unfair and you speak up about it. Every time you treat someone with kindness even when others don't. Every time you question why things are the way they are instead of just accepting them. Zoe had hugged him tight, and Marcus had felt that familiar ache, love and fear and hope all tangled together. The weight of knowing she'd face her own battles, her own moments of injustice, her own choices about whether to stay silent or speak up. But at least he was showing her how. Jennifer Whitmore had finished her volunteer hours at the community center, but she'd kept coming back. Had become a regular presence in the after-school program, helping kids with homework and art projects, learning names and stories, building relationships instead of barriers. She'd sent Marcus an update email every month for the first 6 months, then stopped, not because she'd quit the work, but because she'd realized the work wasn't about proving something to him anymore. It was about who she was becoming. Marcus had run into her once at a community fundraiser for the center. They'd both been uncomfortable at first, not sure how to navigate the space between victim and perpetrator, between harm and healing. But then Jamal, the boy Jennifer had mentioned on the phone, had run up to her with a drawing he'd made of a rocket ship, and Marcus had watched her face light up with genuine affection. "Mr. Marcus," Jamal had shouted, recognizing him from another volunteer event. "Miss Jennifer's teaching us about space. Did you know that there are planets made entirely of diamonds?" Marcus had smiled. "I didn't know that. That's pretty amazing."
"Everything's amazing when you actually pay attention to it," Jennifer had said softly, meeting Marcus's eyes over Jamal's head. There was no expectation in her gaze, no plea for forgiveness or absolution, just acknowledgement, just truth. Marcus had nodded, and that had been enough. Now, on this spring morning, Marcus was driving toward the airport for another pickup. The same route he'd driven that rainy October night, but everything felt different. The sky was clear and bright, the highway dry and easy, the city spread out below him like a promise waiting to be kept. His phone chimed with the passenger details. Michael Chen, businessman, pick up from a corporate hotel downtown, drop off at the airport. Marcus pulled up to the hotel, and a middle-aged Asian man emerged with a rolling suitcase and a leather briefcase. He loaded his own bags into the trunk before Marcus could offer, then climbed into the front passenger seat. A small gesture, but one Marcus noticed. Some people sat in the back because they wanted privacy or space to work. But some sat in the back because sitting next to the driver felt too equal, too familiar. Michael Chen choosing the front seat was a choice. "Good morning," Michael said warmly. "Marcus, right? I saw your name on the app. Thanks for being prompt. Early flight to catch." "No problem. We'll get you there with time to spare." They pulled into traffic, and Marcus expected the usual small talk or comfortable silence. But after a few minutes, Michael spoke again. "I saw your interview, the one you did with NPR about driver discrimination. Made me think about my own behavior, the assumptions I carry without realizing." Marcus glanced over, surprised. "Yeah?"
My first instinct when I book a ride is always relief when I see the driver has a certain kind of name. Sounds terrible to admit out loud, but it's true. Your story made me realize that relief is just prejudice wearing a disguise. Michael shook his head. So I'm trying to do better. Notice those instincts, question them, push back against my own internal bias. That's the work, Marcus said quietly. Most people never even get that far. Well, I appreciate you doing the harder work, speaking up, making people like me uncomfortable enough to change. Michael paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for every time a driver had to deal with someone like me before I figured this out. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. This was why he'd fought. Not just for justice in one case, but for these moments, strangers on a Tuesday morning, choosing to see each other clearly, choosing to do the uncomfortable work of growth. Thank you, Marcus said. That means more than you know. They talked for the rest of the ride, about Michael's work in tech, about Marcus's daughter and her dreams of becoming a marine biologist, about the city and its changes, about the small ways people could make each other's lives better. It was easy conversation, human conversation, the kind Marcus had always wanted to have, but so often couldn't because he was too busy managing someone else's fear. When they pulled up to the airport, Michael insisted on leaving a generous tip. Not because I pity you, he clarified, but because this was genuinely the best ride I've had in years. Sometimes it's nice to remember that we're all just people trying to get where we need to go. Marcus watched him disappear into the terminal, then sat in the arrivals lane for a moment, letting himself feel the fullness of it, the exhaustion and the hope, the anger and the progress, the reality that he'd still face discrimination, and the knowledge that he'd fight it every time, the weight of carrying all this, and the lightness of knowing he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. His phone chimed with another ride request, another stranger, another story waiting to unfold.
Marcus accepted it, put the car in drive, and merged back into traffic. The radio was playing something soft and melodic, and the sun was warm through the windshield. And somewhere in the north suburbs, his daughter was probably getting ready for school, probably thinking about marine biology and ocean creatures, probably carrying the lessons he'd taught her about standing up and speaking out and refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Maybe that was the real bridge, Marcus thought. Not the ones he'd drawn in notebooks or the ones he'd tried to build through legal complaints and policy changes, but the ones he was building between who he was and who his daughter would become, between the world as it was and the world as it could be, between the harm he'd experienced and the healing he chose to pursue. Those bridges didn't appear overnight. They required patience and work, careful attention to every joint and cable, constant maintenance against the forces trying to tear them down. But they were possible, they were real, and they were worth every moment of effort. Marcus drove on through the spring morning, through the city he knew by heart, carrying passengers who would never know his full story, but who would, in small ways, be touched by the ripples of what he'd set in motion. And somewhere high above, where bridges met sky, where the weight of what was lifted toward what could be, Marcus felt his father looking down and nodding. Proud. So there you have it, a rainy October night, a taxi ride, a moment of fear that could have ended in tragedy, but instead became a catalyst for change. Marcus's story is just one among thousands, moments that happen every day when people are forced to prove their humanity, when assumptions override reality, when the distance between strangers feels insurmountable. But here's what I want you to think about, really think about. What would you have done? If you'd been Jennifer Whitmore that night, would you have questioned your fear? Would you have asked yourself where it came from and whether it was justified?
Or would you have let it guide your actions without examination, convinced that your instinct to be afraid was keeping you safe? And if you'd been Marcus, would you have pressed charges? Would you have taken the easier path of accepting a settlement and moving on? Or would you have chosen the harder road of demanding real change, even knowing it would require reliving your trauma again and again? These aren't comfortable questions. They're not meant to be. Because change, real, lasting change, doesn't come from comfort. It comes from the willingness to sit in discomfort long enough to understand it, to see ourselves clearly, biases and all, to recognize that good intentions don't erase harmful impact. Marcus didn't set out to be an activist or a hero. He just set out to do his job and live his life with dignity. But when that dignity was threatened, he made a choice. He chose to stand up, to speak out, to demand that his humanity be recognized. And in doing so, he created ripples that touched lives he'll never meet, changed minds he'll never know about, built bridges toward a future where maybe, just maybe, his daughter won't have to fight the same battles. That's the power of refusing to stay silent, of turning pain into purpose, of recognizing that justice isn't just about one resolution to one conflict, but about the patterns we break and the new pathways we create. So I'll ask you again, what would you have done? And more importantly, what will you do the next time you witness injustice, experience discrimination, or feel that instinctive fear that might just be prejudice in disguise? The answer matters. Your choice matters. Because every time someone chooses courage over comfort, accountability over avoidance, growth over defensiveness, another bridge gets built. Another connection gets made. Another step forward gets taken toward the world we all deserve to live in.
If Marcus's story moved you, if it made you think, or question, or commit to doing better, then subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind everyday injustice. Stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Stories that remind us that change is possible when we're willing to do the work. Because the taxi ride that changed 2 lives didn't end in that spring morning. It's still unfolding. In every conversation sparked by Jennifer's apology video. In every policy implemented because of Marcus's complaint. In every child at that community center who grows up knowing they're valued. In every person watching this who commits to examining their own biases and doing better. The bridge is still being built. The question is, will you help carry the weight? Subscribe, share this story, and the next time you're faced with a choice between comfort and courage, between silence and speaking up, between accepting things as they are and fighting for things as they should be, remember Marcus. Remember that one person standing up in one moment can create ripples that reach farther than we can imagine. Remember that the best things can't be rushed, that they need time to become what they're meant to be, and that sometimes the longest journey begins with a single ride through the rain, toward a destination we can't yet see, but trust is worth reaching for. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being willing to do the uncomfortable work of growth. Now, go build some bridges.